Hello and welcome to Manny Bean. This time I have decided to jump over section 14 of book 1, part 3. Section 13 of book 1, part 3, which is called Of Unphilosophical Probability. It's more than half an hour of audiobook of pointing out various ways of arguing that is not valid or false out. What's it called? False for the criterion of empiricism. And basically, what Hume is arguing, in my opinion, but very convoluted, is that in order for X to be known, you need to have an experience of X. You need to have an impression. Hume might not agree completely with me on this because he calls knowledge a comparison of ideas. I would say that's not correct. That's not. I would say I can't say that his definition is not correct because that's his definition. I can't say that it's not correct, so that I would like to retract that. But I would say I disagree. I would have another definition, which would be it has to do with. I wouldn't give you my definition, but it has to do with direct empiricism, which is I have to have an experience of X in order to know X, right? So I need an impression in order to know what it is that I'm claiming. The knowledge has to be a part of my expression when I claim the knowledge. I don't even have to claim the knowledge because if I'm the only one there, if I'm sitting alone on an island, I'm not making propositions, right? If anything, I'm making them implicit in my mind, so to say, right? I'm not eating the fish I'm catching tomorrow, right? I'm never eating the fish I'm catching tomorrow. I will have to eat the fish that I experience tomorrow and that I catch and that I split up and fry on the fire or whatever, right? I have to have a direct experience of it. When you eat something, you are empirically eating. You're not eating yesterday, you're not eating tomorrow, you are eating now. You're always eating now, right? You can talk about eating as an idea, but that's not knowledge. That you ate something yesterday is not knowledge. It's a memory, it's whatever you want to call it, right? You have a reference to it, but it's not knowledge because you don't have experience of it. A memory of X is not knowledge of X. So he's dealing very much with, for instance, Julius Caesar. It's a sort of a series of causes that leads to me having the potential knowledge that there was a guy called Julius Caesar. But it's so removed from me in this causal chain that it cannot possibly be, in my opinion, I might have rephrasing Hume here, right? That it cannot possibly be knowledge, right? And I'm using the term knowledge because that's a sort of a central term for me. And also this is a little confusing reading Hume, that we might have quite different understanding of the use of the terms, right? So I would encourage you to read it for yourself, and at some point I might make a pure audio version of that particular part and add it to this playlist here, right? So I will be stepping into part 14, which is called Of the Idea of Necessary Connection.
File 29 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 3. Section 14 of the Idea of Necessary Connection. Having thus explained the manner in which we reason beyond our immediate impressions and conclude that such particular causes must have such particular effects, we must now return upon our footsteps to examine that question which, in Section 2, first occurred to us and which we dropped in our way, that is, what is our idea of necessity when we say that two objects are necessarily connected together? Upon this head, I repeat what I have often had occasion to observe, that as we have no idea that is not derived from an impression, we must find some impression that gives rise to this idea of necessity if we assert we have really such an idea.
This could be a quote. As we have no idea that is not derived from an impression. That's the founding bottom layer of his philosophy, right? Of his ontology. Then we must find some impression that gives rise to the idea of necessity. If you have an idea of necessity, there must be some kind of impression behind it, right? Okay, now the complication might be that when we create complex ideas out of a set of simple ideas, where the simple idea always have an impression, that complex idea might not have an impression. He stated that very early on in his philosophy, that as far as I understand, and I remember him stating it, at least that's part of my resume one, right? And you can go back and listen to that one. That let's say that you have an impression of polar bear, right? Then therefore you also have now the idea of polar bear. And when you look at polar bear, or the idea of polar bear, you say it has 4 legs. But could you mentally take a couple of those legs and add new ones on the side, on the top, or something like that? Yeah, no problem. I can do that. It's faint. It's a weak vivacity, or it's a weak force in the impression, or in the idea, compared to the impression. But I can do that. I can imagine a polar bear with 6 legs. But that doesn't mean that there was an impression of a polar bear with 6 legs, but there was an impression of a polar bear with 4 legs. And then I added 2 other legs to it mentally, right? By my computing power, so to say. Copy-pasting sub-concepts within the concept, or within the idea of polar bear, right? So if he says that there must be an impression, he has to clarify whether he's talking of imagine, or he's ruling out, which I implicitly think that he must be ruling out, artificial or what would that be, synthetic complex ideas that haven't had an impression yet, right?
In order to this, I consider in what objects necessity is commonly supposed to lie, and finding that it is always ascribed to causes and effects, I turn my eye to 2 objects supposed to be placed in that relation, and examine them in all the situations of which they are susceptible. I immediately perceive that they are contiguous in time and place, and that the object we call cause precedes the other we call effect. In no one instance can I go any farther, nor is it possible for me to discover any third relation betwixt these objects. I therefore enlarge my view to comprehend several instances where I find like objects always existing in like relations of contiguity and succession. At first sight, this seems to serve but little to my purpose. The reflection on several instances only repeats the same objects, and therefore can never give rise to a new idea. But upon farther inquiry, I find that the repetition is not in every particular the same, but produces a new impression, and by that means the idea which I at present examine. For after a frequent repetition, I find that upon the appearance of one of the objects, the mind is determined by custom to consider its usual attendant, and to consider it in a stronger light upon account of its relation to the first object. It is this impression, then, or determination, which affords me the idea of necessity.
Yes, that's actually a good point. If I could, this markup thing here. Upon appearance of one of the objects, the mind is determined by custom, because you have seen it before, so to say, right? You have memory. Oh, okay, this, as I showed in my cause and effect introduction, one of the videos prior to this one, where we deal with cause and effect. I have an introduction where I present my idea of cause and effect, or causation. That is that there's particular situations that have repeated through the structure of your memory, and you say sort of, aha, there is some pattern here, right? It's just that when you look at your memory, or the memory, you look at itself, or the awareness, or subconscious, even whatever is going on, right? That it identifies a pattern, and think, okay, each time I eat an ice cream, it tastes good, right? So if I eat ice cream, I will have the taste of good, so to say, right? It's not that you know it, but that's why when you see the ad for the tasty, nice, ice cream, you think, wow, tastes good, tastes good, tastes good, right? So you go and buy the ice cream. If you hadn't seen the ice cream, you might, I'm not thinking of ice cream at the moment, right? But if that's why the cookbooks without pictures, only recipes, are not selling as good as cookbooks with very nice, tasty looking, fresh looking food, right? So it's the expectation from prior experiences. That's what he says here, basically, right? On appearance of one of the objects, the mind is determined by custom. Oh, the ice cream, right? To consider its usual attendant, which is, tastes nice, right? Tastes good. And consider it in a stronger light upon account of its relation of the first. Because I have this expectation, it's because I've had the expectation that I attach the goodness to the ice cream. But the goodness is different from the ice cream. There is no necessarily a built-in connection between them, other than I have a memory of that pattern, right? Or I have the memories, and I deduce a pattern from my memories and impress that, or place that as a part of existence, right? Or I might be tempted to do that. I personally have never done that, right? I don't think I have always worked with the idea of causality. I mean, it's built into science, right? Without causality, it's doomed, right? Then you just shut the fuck up and go away with your science, right? Who cares? So, I mean, any formula in science is basically saying something like, this was the case in the past, I have checked in the now, and I expect this to be the case in future. When these or that composition of a situation is the case, then a new situation would be there in such a short amount of time after the first situation, then the second situation will be composed this way, right? That's basically what science does. Science predicts the future based on the idea of causality. Right? That's quite short, maybe, right? But it's always something like that, right? So it might also be something that describes a balance in the now, so to say, right? If if a thing is composed of like this, you can describe it in three other ways, the same thing, right? And what I'm thinking of here is like E equals mc squared, right? You can talk, okay, this thing has energy, but you can also express it as mc squared, right? It has mc squared. It has energy, but this is mc squared, something like that, right? And fine, but the really powerful aspect of science is it can help you predict whether, for instance, a bridge will hold or not, right? Everybody can build a bridge. I mean, maybe it's a physically approaching impossibility, but anybody could build a bridge, but that doesn't mean that you can drive your car over it necessarily, right? Then when you're doing science, you are basically saying, okay, if you have a situation now that won't get to situation one, that won't get to the situation two that you need. You have a situation one, there is no bridge, right? Situation two is, I would like there to be a bridge. But if I'm standing at situation one and just waiting for situation two to arrive, the bridge will possibly never be there, right? It sounds unlikely. So you have to do something about situation one in order to get to that wanted situation two. So you start mixing your labor and your will and so on to situation one in order to get to a situation two that is concordant with your ideas of how it should be. That's why you use science. You change the situation so situation two becomes the case at that point. And the scientific approach is a way to establish that situation without using anything but empiricism. And prior experiences, of course prior necessary connections, you could see, where this led to that, right? Every time you need to shorten a piece of wood, you use a saw and you saw it, and then, well, you have done that so many times before. It usually happens that you split it in two by sawing it, right? Then you're sawing it. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of little causes and effects that is being utilized to build that bridge. And the bigger cause is there wasn't a bridge, now there is a bridge, right? And all these little causes and effects have to be utilized, and nothing but it. You can't just say, well, just think of two pieces of wood instead of one, and then there will be two pieces of wood. That doesn't work. That's not empirical, right? That's not cause and effect based. So that's why I'm saying that science is an approach that is cause and effect and empiricism based, right? Okay.
I doubt not, but these consequences will at first sight be received without difficulty, as being evident deductions from principles which we have already established and which we have often employed in our reasonings. This evidence, both in the first principles and in the deductions, may seduce us unwarily into the conclusion and make us imagine it contains nothing extraordinary nor worthy of our curiosity. But though such an inadvertence may facilitate the reception of this reasoning, it will make it be the more easily forgot, for which reason I think it proper to give warning that I have just now examined one of the most sublime questions in philosophy, that is, that concerning the power and efficacy of causes, where all the sciences seem so much interested. Such a warning will naturally rouse up the attention of the reader, and make him desire a more full account of my doctrine, as well as of the arguments on which it is founded. This request is so reasonable that I cannot refuse complying with it, especially as I am hopeful that these principles, the more they are examined, will acquire the more force and evidence. There is no question which, on account of its importance as well as difficulty, has caused more disputes both among ancient and modern philosophers than this concerning the efficacy of causes, or that quality which makes them be followed by their effects. But before they entered upon these disputes, methinks it would not have been improper to have examined what idea we have of that efficacy, which is the subject of the controversy. This is what I find principally wanting in their reasonings, and what I shall here endeavor to supply. I begin with observing that the terms of efficacy, agency, power, force, energy, necessity, connection, and productive quality are all nearly synonymous, and therefore it is an absurdity to employ any of them in defining the rest. By this observation, we reject at once all the vulgar definitions which philosophers have given of power and efficacy.
Yeah, it's these sort of tautological statements, right? Definitions, like, for instance, to step into ethics, right? Murder is wrong, right? Well, what would a definition of murder be? Well, it's a wrong kind of killing, right? So when you say murder is wrong, you're saying a wrong kind of killing is wrong. Well, yeah, obviously, because that's the definition of the word, right? Of the aspect you're trying to refer to. So it's like saying if I a potato, or how would I put this? A banana is yellow. That's also the same kind of argumentation, right? A banana is yellow. Well, banana is a yellow kind of fruit, right? It's a yellow object. You're calling it banana, and one of the aspects of banana is that it, let's say, tend to be yellow. It could be sort of greenish, right? But or even brown. But you know what I mean, right? What I'm trying to get at. There is, in the first term, there is a built-in part of what you're trying to describe in the term. Murder is wrong. Well, murder is a wrong kind of killing. So you're pointing, you're using, well, wrong killing, and you take these two words, lump them together, call them murder. So now you can no longer see the wrong part of it directly in the term called murder. And therefore you could go and say murder is wrong, as if you are creating some argument there, but you're just camouflaging the wrongness into a new word, right? And it's sort of the same kind of linguistic game that Hume really wants to avoid here. And it's sign of a good and rigid and high integrity kind of philosopher, in my opinion.
And instead of searching,
I'm not saying that he necessarily always avoids the trap himself, and I don't think it's inhuman to expect somebody to not, in some way or another, make this kind of linguistic circular kind of structure, right?
searching for the idea in these definitions must look for it in the impressions from which it is originally derived. If it be a compound idea, it must arise from compound impressions. If simple, from simple impressions. I believe the most general and most popular explication of this matter is to say, see Mr. Locke, Chapter of Power, that finding from experience that there are several new productions in matter, such as the motions and variations of body, and concluding that there must somewhere be a power capable of producing them, we arrive at last by this reasoning at the idea of power and efficacy. But to be convinced that this explication is more popular than philosophical, we need but reflect on two very obvious principles. First, that reason alone can never give rise to any original idea. And secondly, that reason, as distinguished from experience, can never make us conclude that a cause or productive quality is absolutely requisite to every beginning of existence. Both these considerations have been sufficiently explained, and therefore shall not at present be any farther insisted on.
Okay, so let's dive a bit into that one, see if I can say something qualified. That reason alone can never give rise to any original idea. No, because an idea is something that comes from an impression. So you can reason your way to an impression. That seems to be ruled out, right? Excuse me, to an idea. And secondly, that reason as distinguished from experience can never make us conclude that a cause or productive quality is absolutely requisite to every beginning of existence. No, that would be a circular argument, I guess. So, let me try to understand this. Reason, because it's different from experience, can never make us conclude that a cause or productive quality is absolutely requisite to every beginning of existence. I would agree. You're there. I would say my ontology would point that out very clearly, right? You have my ontology is something like, and go watch my my video called "The Structure of My Metaphysics," right? I'm beginning to call it actually ontology, because I might want to get rid of the idea of metaphysics in my philosophy altogether, right? Because I find it to be so confusing how people use the term metaphysics. Though I would say that doing ontology is also metaphysics, right? Because we're talking about that which has to be settled in order for you to understand what you do when you're doing physics. Even Aristotle, who is responsible for the term metaphysics, would say that, I would say, right? I would think. Now, I would never try to understand Aristotle's metaphysics. It's impenetrable for me, right? So I have to rely on how other people present Aristotle. But it's something like the four causes, right? I don't remember the terms, but it's something, what is it made of? What is its shape, or how does it get to its shape, and has it arrived at its shape? Something like that, right? Or is it at its function? You can look it up. There are four causes, right? These are sort of a description of what is going on without explaining what is going on, right? It's a metaphysics in the sense that these are foundational four causes that is foundational to all of physics. So no matter what you're doing in physics, you are always describing something that is doing these four causes, right? Therefore, it's metaphysics. But it's not, in the case of Aristotle, he's not describing some realm beyond his mind or something like that, right? The things themselves, rather than, what I have access to, the experience of it, right? So the term of metaphysics has been screwed a bit. It has been expanded since the days of Aristotle, right? You could say in the Kantian and Hegelian and way of thinking of idealism, so to say, right? And therefore there is, if you say that metaphysics is only about what is beyond or below or underneath or subordinate or more, even more important than what is in my metaphysics, then that is metaphysics. If you're an idealist, you are saying, I'm going outside my mind and telling you about what is outside my mind. When I step back into my mind, I'm doing ontology. I'm describing what is, as they say. Well, but then idealists also talk very much about what is outside their mind. In a fashion that seems like they're talking about what is, right? At least it's something that is more important than what is in the mind, which is then called ontology. So I'm sort of confused about this screw around with these terms, right? So, and I wouldn't care too much about it, because is it necessary that it has a term? Yeah, maybe when you're discussing, you're telling people about it, but if I was sitting alone on an island, it doesn't really matter whether I call it metaphysics or ontology or some third or fourth word, right? Okay, so in my ontology, everything stems from color, sound, taste, smell, and the five senses, let's just say, right? So you know what I mean. Everything else, these five senses are responsible for everything else, ultimately responsible, right? It's not directly, there are might be certain steps it goes through before it becomes, for instance, awareness or something like that, or consciousness or whatever, right? But ultimately, I can trace everything back to an experience. If not directly back to an experience, then through memory or something like that, back to an experience, right? Like equalia. Maybe I should say equalia, right? A color, a sound, a taste, a feel, or a touch, right? One of these five, I can always trace it back. So that is my starting point. That is my reduction base, the qualia, right? And from the qualia, I cognize, for instance, elephants and so on, right? And from that, I make decisions of this, that, categorizing four-legged animals and creating science and all sorts of shit, right? Based ultimately on those impressions, right? As Hume would call them. He says, as distinguished from experience, can never make us conclude that a cause or productive quality is absolutely requisite to every beginning of existence. No, because then it would always be before you are experiencing that which you say has a beginning. You can never get to the beginning, because that is something that is supposedly kickstarting that which you could experience, right? And if it's sort of in this Big Bang theory thing, which was also, not a part of Hume's day, right? That you can sort of wind the clock all the way back, God knows how many billion years, right? And that there was some kind of beginning. That is pure speculation, right? It's pure imagination, you could say. Not that it is necessarily incorrect just because you can't experience it, but it is speculation. It's not empirical, right? It is extending empiricism in the now and recent descriptions of empiricism and observation back 13.6 billion years, right? That's and you could also say, why would I care about history older than the rise of the modern human being, right? Why would I care about that? And honestly, I don't care too much about it, right? It is an interesting thought experiment and so on. I'm much more interested in how to get in a summer holiday with my children, for instance, right? Whether or not there was quarks or whatever there was 13.6 billion years ago, right? I don't give a shit. And that's another story, right? But it's the connection between when this is the case, then this becomes the case, and because this is the case, then this, because this endless chain of causality, right? But if you ultimately wind that ultimate beginning of existence, then that beginning of existence is from no existence to existence. And that existence is what you have access to. You do not have access to that which is responsible potentially for that existence. You can, at some point, you lose yourself. You lose the connection, the scientific connection to an object before that was responsible for the effect, right? So the end station, there are some end station that you can't say that it will happen in the future, and at the other end it goes so far back that you don't have it, right? You don't even have it as a memory, right? So these loose ends, I think, is what Hume is going to use.
I shall only infer from them that since reason can never give rise to the idea of efficacy, that idea must be derived from experience, and from some particular instances of this efficacy, which make their passage into the mind by the common channels of sensation or reflection. Ideas always represent their objects or impressions, and vice versa. There are some objects necessary to give rise to every idea. If we pretend, therefore, to have any just idea of this efficacy, we must produce some instance wherein the efficacy is plainly discoverable to the mind and its operations obvious to our consciousness or sensation. By the refusal of this, we acknowledge that the idea is impossible and imaginary, since the principle of innate ideas, which alone can save us from this dilemma, has been already refuted, and is now almost universally rejected in the learned world. Our present business, then, must be to find some natural production where the operation and efficacy of a cause can be clearly conceived and comprehended by the mind without any danger of obscurity or mistake. In this research, we meet with very little encouragement from that prodigious diversity which is found in the opinions of those philosophers who have pretended to explain the secret force and energy of causes. See Father Malebranche, Book 6, Part 2, Chapter 3, and the illustrations upon it. There are some who maintain that bodies operate by their substantial form, others by their accidents or qualities, several by their matter and form, some by their form and accidents, others by certain virtues and faculties distinct from all this. All these sentiments, again, are mixed and varied in 1,000 different ways, and form a strong presumption that none of them have any solidity or evidence, and that the supposition.
This chapter is about getting rid of all bad philosophy, right? And end up in a situation where you have a balanced, I'm hazarding a guess here, right? If I know Hume correctly, right? Getting rid of all the bullshit. See what is left, right? Trying to get rid of all the wants and needs to explain. And people, philosophers, going out on a limb and inflicting their wishful kind of philosophy because they need to explain this, that, and the other, right? Where being skeptical is actually mostly about saying, well, how do I get to this? How am I arguing for this, right? Am I just inflicting my bad kind of thinking on myself and everybody else in the same go? Because I want to go there, and not because it's necessarily good argumentation. The skeptic says, well, how am I arguing? Okay, how is this philosopher arguing? I don't like that argumentation. I don't trust it. Okay, let me look at another one. Okay, don't trust that. It doesn't sound like it's a rigid argumentation. I don't trust that either. That's basically what he does. He looks at argumentation, not very good. Go away. This argumentation, not very good. Go go away, right? And he's sort of left to his own devices and say, okay, what is left? What am I left with, right? And he will probably tell you, you cannot get to an impression of necessary connections. Maybe he calls it necessary connections instead of causation. Causation is that it is there. Necessary connection is saying, I need to bring it in order to explain this, that, and the other in my everyday, because I use it all the time, right? When I eat that ice cream, I expect it to taste good, right? And that's why I'm eating it. If it didn't taste good, I wouldn't eat it, right? So I'm working from the idea of the necessary connections, but that's not the same as saying I am experiencing necessary connections out there, right? And he wants to make that distinction. I think I don't think that Hume is saying, just like the misunderstandings of the is-ought problem, right? That he's misunderstood as somebody who says there is no causation. No, he's just saying you can't experience causation, so don't argue as if it's something that is out there, right? If you can't experience it, you can't say it's out there. He wouldn't be able to say it's not out there either, because he's not experiencing it, right? If you can't experience, the answer is, I don't know. So the only thing you can say is, I am working personally from the idea of a necessary connection. I think that sort of the ball game he's doing here, right?
Of an efficacy in any of the known qualities of matter is entirely without foundation. This presumption must increase upon us when we consider that these principles of substantial forms and accidents and faculties are not in reality any of the known properties of bodies, but are perfectly unintelligible and inexplicable. For it is evident philosophers would never have had recourse to such obscure and uncertain principles had they met with any satisfaction in such as are clear and intelligible, especially in such an affair as this, which must be an object of the simplest understanding, if not of the senses. Upon the whole, we may conclude that it is impossible in any one instance to shew the principle in which the force and agency of a cause is placed, and that the most refined and most vulgar understandings are equally at a loss in this particular. If anyone think proper to refute this assertion, he need not put himself to the trouble of inventing any long reasonings, but may at once shew us an instance of a cause where we discover the power or operating principle. This defiance we are obliged frequently to make use of, as being almost the only means of proving a negative in philosophy. The small success which has been met with in all the attempts to fix this power has at last obliged philosophers to conclude that the ultimate force and efficacy of nature is perfectly unknown to us, and that it is in vain we search for it in all the known qualities of matter. In this opinion, they are almost unanimous, and it is only...
This is a very powerful statement. The ultimate force and efficacy of nature is perfectly unknown to us, and that it is in vain we search for it in all the known qualities of matter. I like it actually very much, because this is pointing out that from the experience, let me try to put it this way. When people philosophize, they usually philosophize about the abstractions they have from their experience. They use all the ideas, all these enormous amounts of ideas and using various simple or complex or very complex ideas and then start philosophizing about that. That's also what science does, actually, right? Or let's say quantum mechanics, right? Where an idea is superseded by a new idea that is superseded by another idea, and so on, right? The atom, the molecule, the atom, the fundamental particles, and even deeper fundamental particles, and even deeper, these are all ideas and abstractions, right? And trying to reduce an abstraction to a lower level abstraction that is then, reduced to yet another abstraction and another abstraction will never work, because these abstractions, as I try to point out in my ontology, were all derived from some kind of impression, some kind of qualia, right? The idea of the object is only in your mind. It's nowhere else. I can't say it's nowhere else, but it's a logical leap that if you're treating your experiences as representations of something outside, then you are saying that it is something different. It is not the thing itself, it's a representation which is different, right? So that which you experience is not the thing itself. I'm almost willing to go there, right? I'm still sort of, it could possibly be the same thing, right? But it's not logical that there's a problem in saying that rather than being a perfect one-to-one picture of what is out there, it seems more efficient that my experience would be a very simplified and only necessary picture for doing whatever the purpose is of that picture. Is the necessity or the reason for the picture being there to have a complete understanding of what might be out there? If I'm saying it's a picture of something out there, well, no, why would I need that? Why would I need a one-to-one copy of that which is beyond? And is it even possible to think along these lines, right? It's much more reasonable to say that it's a very refined and simplified, let's say, representation of something outside that is completely different, that is paradigmatically different from what is out there, right? That means if I'm talking about my experiences and how my experiences move around, then I'm just talking about that representation and how my representation functions, right? Then you are talking about, if you're photographing the moon, right? Then if you're talking about science, you are talking about how the photographs are composed and how why this color, that color, and so on. You're not talking about the moon, you're talking about the photographs of the moon, right? But if you extend that and say, well, there are necessary connections out there, then you're saying that connection that is in my mind is also out there in that which I do not have access to, where I'm using that description of my experience and just throwing it out there in a one-to-one kind of. But if my mind is a representation, then any connection between those things must also be a representation. And if my mind is totally different from that which is out there, then I can't say there's any causation out there, right? So it's this kind of skeptical kind of philosophy that points out you have to stay with your experiences and what you do with them. You are the only one having your experiences. You only have your own experience. Even if somebody tells you, I have this experience, well, that which they tell you is your interpretation of an experience. the sound of their voice, or the colors of the paper and ink that you interpret in a certain way is just colors, right? You just accustomed yourself to interpret in a certain way. So I don't think that Hume will get so deep into it as I'm here, sort of the I'm somewhere between materialism and idealism, right? And I haven't yet met anybody who has quite the same approach as I have. Either they reject an external world while talking about, they reject an external world that they don't have access to, right? Actually, I would say, if there's one thing that is common to both materialists and idealists, it is the obviousness of an external world, right? Materialists treat their experience as the outside world, and the idealists say, no, there is an outside world, but it's not your experience, but now I'm going to tell you what it is instead, right? Rather than saying, how the hell do you get to an outside world, right? But what is it about your experience? If your experience is your world, then why do you think there's something outside it, right? And at first you need to establish that, and so on and so on and so on. It's a longer story, right? But he is poking at some very, very deep and foundational things here, right? And he's also poking at a lot of philosophers, not only back then, way back in, to ancient times. They were going into all sorts of leaps that enabled them to say a hell of a lot of things about something they could not possibly have access to, right? The old analogy of the cave, right? It's a metaphor, it's an analogy, it's a story, right? But it appeals to that there is some better world where you can go out and see the light, but all these poor bastards, they are living in that gray reality in the cave, right? But the philosophers can walk out and see the real world and sort of, right? It's sort of, I've never been too fond of that analogy, right? And Hume really wants, he's not ruling anything out, but he wants to look at the argumentations and find flaws in the argumentation. He's been deconstructing other philosophers all his young life until then, right? Possibly for 10 years or whatever, right? As far as I understood, he started going to university when he was 10 or 11 years old or something, or maybe 12 years old, when he followed his big brother there, because he was known to be quite a smart kid, right? So he has maybe been studying philosophy for 15 years and reading all this bullshit philosophy and history and saying, what the hell are they doing, man, right? And he's probably this sort of naive young guy, I imagine here, right? He's coming to university, hey, I'm smart. And, let me read some of these smart people because I want to be even smarter. And when he reads it, it's sort of, what the hell are they doing? Is this philosophy? I mean, how do you combine this with Newtonian physics and so on? How does this work? They're just throwing around bullshit left and right? And he wants to say, no, they can't be right. And he reads some more philosophy. This is crap philosophy also. And he reads some John Locke and say, okay, this guy seems to have onto something. But no, again, they have fabulations about things that they can't experience and so on. They're violating their own foundations and so on, right? And he's probably saying when he's sort of 25 years old, I'm going to fucking write my own book on philosophy. I've come up with so many refutations of all this bullshit philosophy. I'm going to write my own treatise, right? And that's sort of how it comes across to me, right?
Only in the inference they draw from it that they discover any difference in their sentiments. For some of them, as the Cartesians in particular, having established it as a principle that we are perfectly acquainted with the essence of matter, have very naturally inferred that it is endowed with no efficacy and that it is impossible for it of itself to communicate motion or produce any of those effects which we ascribe to it. As the essence of matter consists in extension, and as extension implies not actual motion, but only mobility, they conclude that the energy which produces the motion cannot lie in the extension. This conclusion...
Okay, I think I'll have to stop it here and say this is the end of this part, and I'll get back to the necessary connections in the next part, so see you there.